I think all the comrades are familiar with Michael Roberts from his famous blog and on economics. And we've asked him to come and speak, which he's agreed to do, on the subject of democratic public investment as a key to economic development. And I know he does write about this quite regularly in his different pieces. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't remember a very long blog where he's focused on this. He probably has, and I've just missed it. But it'd be very interesting to hear his latest take on this. And I suppose this will be even more relevant as we come out of the virus, and we'll have a situation where economies will be in chaos in a lot of countries, All right, so Michael, can I pass over to you now? Yeah?
Sure. Well,
Great.
The subject is quite wide-ranging, and I think in many ways still open to debate and discussion what democratic public investment might mean and how it would be applied. But it is certainly an issue that is going to increase in intensity to understand, because one of the things that we've learned from this pandemic is the total failure of private investment and the market economy in dealing with the COVID pandemic, not only from the point of view of the pharmaceutical companies having spent no money whatsoever in research for potential vaccines that come from the pandemics, the pathogens that are already being in human beings in previous pandemics that we've had for the last 25 years. I saw a measure the other day which said of the 19 US pharmaceutical companies, 16 do no research whatsoever in vaccines or any diseases that particularly affect the poorer parts of the world. And of those 3, none of them really do any vaccine research in the pandemics that are now appeared, in particular COVID-19. That's an indication that as far as the private sector is concerned, this is not profitable, and therefore there has been no investment in it. Only public investment has achieved the target of trying to get a vaccine now, belatedly in 2020 or into 2021. The pharmaceutical companies are now going to make a fat profit out of government contracts that are springing across the board in order to find the vaccine that would help to control this current virus in future, if it can do so. And on the other hand, we've also found that the market economy just doesn't work, and private investment hasn't worked in actually containing the virus. Health systems vary in degree in how much public investment's in them, and whether you have a single care at the point of use health system free, or whether you have a virtually private system, as in the case of the US. It's clear from work that's been done that the more a health system is publicly controlled and invested in, the better has been the containment during this COVID pandemic. And the least effective health systems have been the ones that have been mostly privatized, as in the US. Because the cost, of course, of private health is so high. If you go in for private insurance, that's also high with all kinds of caveats. It's a basic human right, really, that we should have public health invested in by public investment, paid for by the taxation of the population as a large, so that it's free at the point of use. So we've learned already that public services and public investment is absolutely essential to the basic level of human civilization, and we need to dramatically increase that as we come out of this pandemic. And it's not just in health, but it's also in education and in transport and in communications and so on. So I'm just going to, taking us a little bit further down there, I'm just going to show you a few slides which will take us through the point about having said that public investment and public organized systems are essential to human civilization. What does that mean in terms of control and the democratic control of those public investments? Public investment, as far as I'm concerned, starts with the question of public ownership. Without complete control by governments, we cannot really begin to use public investment in the most effective way in order to meet social need. If it's just in the hands of private sector to take contracts from governments and that form of public investment, then we're open to lack of control over what they do. We're charged profit, including prices for what they do. We don't have control over the investment and therefore whether it's meeting the right social need. I'll give you an example. The EU approached the pharmaceutical companies since the COVID has started and said to them, look, we need to get these vaccines done. We need to approach the question properly. And all the pharmaceutical companies said, well, it's not really profitable for us. So on the whole, we're not really interested in doing this. And the EU found, well, we're offering you loads of money to subsidize you doing it. So, well, even so, we're not particularly bothered. So only a few of the pharmaceutical companies agreed to do this and to do it at their own pace and in their own way. So the control by the public sector or the state was very minimal and is very minimal in trying to control whether the public investment is used for social need. And yet it's clear to me, as you look at this diagram, that public investment requires public ownership first at the state level. That's the fundamental. If you think about what is socialism, socialism is as far as I'm concerned, form of human organization which leads to the ability of meeting people's social needs with the minimum amount of toil, where social need is met by the cooperative activities of human beings together, not competing against each other for profit, not owning means of production privately, but all the means of production are owned socially. People work together to achieve that, and there's a democratic process of deciding what to use with how to spend and use the value created by people cooperatively working together. And if you think about that, then that is really only possible on a world scale, because it's not really possible on one national state level to achieve that sort of social cohesion and expansion of production to meet social need, because we face, therefore, the opposition and the distortion provided by the market economy outside of our own particular country or state. However, you have to start somewhere, so you have to start with the national state. But what we're talking about when we're talking about democratic public investment in the current environment is really just a transitional process towards socialism on a world scale, well down the road. So we're just at the very beginning of looking at how you develop democratic forms of control over the public investment that is being made. But the first thing to do is to have public ownership at a state level. Without that, you cannot begin to really put investment in the right direction. As far as I'm concerned, it's not just health, it's education, it's transports, it's communications, it's housing, it's social services. Public services in general should be there. And one of the biggest things that we need to bring in as a public service is to make banking and finance a public service rather than just a speculative operation for criminal conspiracies on the part of banks to hide taxes from government and to engage in all sorts of fraud and speculative events to make money out of the stock market and the bond market, rather than providing a service to meet people's needs. And I'll come to that. And then we also need strategic control of the major sectors of the economy, used to be called in the old days the commanding heights. Without control of the major sectors of the economy under public ownership, then our ability to achieve a successful public investment that's democratically controlled is completely limited. And as I said before, in the equation of the COVID, the private economy and private investment has totally failed. Now, there's usually an argument in the old days when we had state companies back in the 50s and 60s, in many countries, at least in the advanced economies, but also in the so-called developing economies. There's a sizable state sector, particularly in main basic industries. It used to be argued that they were totally inefficient And it would be much more if they were much more efficient if they were privatized, brought into the market economy where competition would rule, and it would help to improve the efficiency and delivery of those services to people. But of course, that's turned out to be a complete nonsense. One of the examples that springs to mind for me is the example of Carillion, which was a construction company, infrastructure company in the UK, which was able to take up a load of contracts that normally would have been done by local governments or public sector operations. And they just used all their money that they were getting from government contracts to pay dividends to their shareholders, running up a huge pensions deficit, and eventually collapsing because they couldn't carry out the program of projects that they had won contracts for from government. And there is no evidence that if the private sector runs the show, whether it's in telecoms or in waste management or in other areas, that they actually are more efficient. The biggest study of privatized companies looking at in Europe found that, in fact, the companies that performed better were the ones that remained public and not those that had been privatized over a period of 10 years. And we've had an experience not only in Europe, but elsewhere of these public-private partnerships, PFI they're called, which have done little to improve the level of public services and investment as a result. Instead of shackled local councils and communes and so on to contracts that are exorbitantly expensive for them to change and also really put them in debt for the foreseeable future. So the private investment approach is totally failed. Public investment is essential. Take banking. What banking should be, it should be a proper banking service for people. What banks should be doing is taking our deposits, looking after our savings, offering loans to households, small businesses for big ticket items at reasonable interest, and not speculating in financial markets, corporate finance deals, or helping the rich to evade tax payments and paying themselves huge, great bonuses as a result. Banking is not a public service now. So if we had public ownership of the banks, it has to also be turned into a public service. And that means, in essence, to have some sort of democratic control over the banking system. There have been banks that have been successful as public sector banks. Take the example of North Dakota, a right-wing US state, which has had a publicly owned state bank since the Great Recession. It looks after the deposits of customers, provides loans and households for farmers, and any profit it makes goes back to the state government revenue. It does no speculation, no money laundering, no tax evasion, and it didn't collapse in the global crash. Yes, it's not very big, but it's an indication of what could be done by the biggest banks. Here's another example out of Costa Rica. Banco Popular Costa Rica is the third largest bank in Costa Rica. It's a completely publicly owned enterprise, and it's democratically run through a cooperative. It has a democratic assembly, representatives meet to discuss what the bank should be doing, or any worker that works or holds a saving account in the bank for over a year has an ownership share like a cooperative share and has some role in the assembly which advises the bank on its strategic direction it should take. And also, as a result, the bank operates a special social bank subsidiary which aims at ecological projects for loans and so on. The sort of approach that a public invested banking system can have is so much better than the private sector. But that doesn't exclude, it seems to me, recognizing the role of cooperative projects and entities. Cooperative ownership has a long history in the socialist and trade union movement, starting with Robert Owen back in the early 19th century. Marx and Engels commented on the role that Owen played in trying to develop the rights of workers to have a say in what was going on in the workplaces that they have now. And there's been a whole range of cooperatives that developed not only in production cooperatives, but also retail cooperatives, credit unions, and so on. And in the 70s, when companies were closed down by governments or by their private owners, then there have been attempts to maintain the workplace and the project through cooperatives. The famous one in the 1970s in the UK was the Lucas Aerospace Company, which mainly produced military planes and equipment. When it was closed in the 1970s, the shop stewards organised a cooperative which turned the strategy away from defence sectors and looked at ecological projects for the first time at that time. So there's potential of ownership which is in the public sector, which uses public investment, but it's worker-owned, it's worker cooperatively owned. So it's not just the level of the high national state level, but also at the level of the cooperative. And so there are a whole range of cooperative movements which still exist around the world, and which, in my view, if connected to the national state sector as part of on an umbilical cord between the two, then the state sector and state investment can help cooperatives to flourish and develop and spread, and the co-ops can provide local-based connection for people with public investment involved. Municipal ownership is another area of democratic reform that we could have in public investment. Even in the USA, there are 230 municipally owned projects and companies in energy, in health, in telecoms, in water and local government. This seems an obvious area in which we can expand the local connection of public investment to the people in that area. So it doesn't have to be a monolith state company at a national level. It can, even if that's providing the basic infrastructure, there's no reason why we can't have municipally or state-owned or lower-level regional-owned companies with democratic control in those companies to allow people to have a say in how they're being run in their area. One example is the Hamburg Municipal Council, which in the last 5 years, under the pressure of people in Hamburg, has successfully nationalized or municipalized the electricity, gas, and other sectors of the city economy, bringing the electricity grid into public ownership, and through that setting up representatives of the community to be involved in how those gas and heating grids and other areas of utilities are run. There is no reason why public investment has to be bureaucratic. It can have the input of the population at large, whether nationally or locally. One of the sops that's often offered by capitalism is the idea, yes, well, maybe you can have workers on the board. This is a common demand. In Germany, most big companies, private sector companies, have workers on the board, but it doesn't make a lot of difference. They don't really have much power to change what those companies do, and often, obviously, they're a minority on the board, and they merely offer, as it were, a veil or cover for management to continue to carry out those policies. I think we would, as socialists, want workers on the board, but we want workers' control of the board. That, in effect, if we're going to have publicly owned boards, then they should be under the control of working class through its various organizations. If we just leave a publicly owned company with no real control by the workers, then they will come under the same pressures that private companies come, looking to meet certain demands set by the private sector. I would like to give you a little map here. I did it for banking, but it could apply across the board. How we might see all those things connected together as a democratic basis for public investment. A national plan for investment and growth is the fundamental thing we have to start with. And what we're saying is that's public investment, then it's going to be publicly owned. So it means that we have agreed targets for investment, whether it's banking finance or whether it's investment in general, with submissions by the various levels of local organizations, including working class organizations, labor organizations. And then on the basis of that plan, both for finance and investment, that can be used to either develop it at a state level with publicly owned banks or strategic sectors of the economy, and at local level, cooperatives and other credit organizations. And how will we run that? Well, it seems to me the fundamental thing is that we have to balance between having not just the workers in a workplace or in a particular company or factory controlling the whole thing, because then they're not connected to the plan, which is necessary for the whole economy and for social need to be met. On the other hand, it can't just be a straightforward state appointee on the boards of these publicly owned companies and public investment companies. we require representatives that spread across the board, both from the national level, from the workers in the actual company or work area, and also from the local community through various organisations, including the trade unions. So you need a spread of how that is to be controlled. On that basis, you can have democratic control of public investment. So this is a project for democratic control is something we're discussing, I suppose, because we can see, not just socialists, but many in the public can see the need for public investment now out of this COVID pandemic. The failure of private investment, the failure of the private sector. People are aware that they need public services, they need public investment to achieve this, and also to get out of this slump that is now come about from the pandemic and the lockdowns. But there will still be that issue of question, how can we ensure that public investment is not just another bureaucratic form of the private sector with the same highly paid management in control, carrying out dictates really of the private sector, trying to make a profit and all the rest of it, rather than having any sort of democratic control from working people. So I've just broadly outlined in these graphs a few ideas about how we would see democratic control working with public investment if that was to come about. It is obviously not on the agenda at the moment. It is in the minds of people that they need public investment. So this is an opportunity to deal with the argument that public investment is inefficient, it's bureaucratic, and it's better to have some sort of individual private economy. Clearly failed. We can show that there is an alternative, and it's an alternative that in fact would actually improve the levels of production, stop waste, involve people in a more effective way to achieve the social needs that people want in all those areas of health, education, housing, and public services in general.
Thanks very much, Michael. Perhaps you can come back to the main screen. That's great. Okay, well, thanks very much. I think that opens up a lot of avenues for questions and comment. So remember, comrades, if you want to speak, you've got to unmute yourself. Okay, so far away. Who would like to say something? We've got 16 participants at the moment, okay, various countries. So don't be shy, get in while you've got your chance. While you're waiting, I've got just a couple of questions I would like Michael to deal with. What I thought we could do is we could take a few comments and questions, and then you could come back once or twice during the course of the session.
Sure.
Couple of quick questions. One was, if you could comment on the importance of public investment with regard to the environment, you know, the way the problems of the planet is facing and how you see public investment relating to that. So that was one important question I would like you to comment on. Perhaps I'll leave it at that and then see if there's other comrades who would like to come in with other questions and comments.
Well, climate change and global warming is the big, they call it the existential threat. In other words, it's something which is so all-encompassing for the world and is clearly a danger which is growing fast towards us, which is going to damage the planet, not just nature, but millions, if not billions of human beings over the next 10, 20, 30 years as a result of global warming through floods, droughts, earthquakes, which are apparently connected also. All this is building up in a dramatic way. And we'd have to say that if we just look at what governments are doing and the capitalist sector is doing about this, it's more or less nothing. Because what is the areas of the capitalist sector which are helping to reduce global warming? Very small amount of renewable investment by the private sector, mainly energy companies. A very small amount of attempts to control the environmental pollution that's been going on from logging, from fossil fuel exploration, from transport, from urbanization. All these so-called external things which capitalist companies are not interested in, they're not spending any money on. So we'd have to say that without public investment, nothing is going to be resolved about the climate change. It's only going to get worse, and the threat that faces human beings and the planet is going to come towards us very fast. I mean, what does that mean? Well, one of the basic things, what is the biggest emitter of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases? It's fossil fuel activity. And if fossil fuel energy companies continue to dominate the energy production and exploration for forms of energy over the next 10 years, then we're doomed. And that's why it seems to me that the first thing to start with public investment is not just having a Green New Deal, which is often talked about, so the government spend money on trying to control emissions and introducing projects to control the environment. We need to stop the emitters. And the emitters are mainly the fossil fuel companies and transport and airline companies and so on. We need public ownership of those companies so that we can then phase out fossil fuel production over the next decade. If we don't phase out fossil fuel production over the next decade, then global warming was going to accelerate, not just go bomb the increase of 1.5 degrees of centigrade above the industrial average of the 19th century, which we're almost hitting now, but we're going to head towards the extreme dangers of 2 degrees above, 3 degrees above. Fossil fuel sector has got to be reduced dramatically and eventually phased out and replaced with other forms of energy which exist and could be technologically applied. But they won't be while the private sector is dominant and while working people have no say whatsoever in how the energy production goes ahead. And as you say, Pat, it's public investment is essential to sorting out this issue, and it won't be sorted out by any other way.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, we have a problem in Brazil, where the capitalist interests are continually burning the Amazon at an increasing rate, especially under this right-wing president, which is a classic example of how we can't afford capitalism if we want to save the planet. So, can I ask for another comment to come in?
I think it's one of the most clear analysis and propositions I've heard for a long, long time, actually. And the interesting thing I found about it is that it concentrates on the basics, on what is necessary, what we can do now, and what we can really suggest. And it doesn't go further than that. We cannot go further than that. I mean, if we try to define democratic control in any detail, we shall be failing, I think. And while it's good to study all the examples that have existed up to now, every single country and every single situation will demand probably different specific measures, different specific modalities of control. And I think this is where most of the attempts to design democratic control is just that they try to go beyond what can be done now. I mean, unless you have a government that is applying these sort of things, you don't know what you have to face. So every situation is different. And I think this is what we have tonight. Is just the right balance of what can be said and what cannot be said now. And I think that's what we should concentrate on. Understand the situation, understand the factors that make something good or bad, but to not try to design a model for democratic control that could probably be completely relevant to a specific situation wherever it might arise.
I don't think I agree with that we can't proceed to look at democratic control. It's not that difficult, I don't think. Even some of the liberals now are looking very closely at participative democracy. We've had a democracy and participation review done in Newham for the Newham Council, which was headed off by a professor Bristol University, who actually was an advisor to Tony Blair at one time, and a team of people who took expert witness statements on how we could proceed, and they came up with a number of innovative ways of doing things. You were using participatory deliberative democracy and co-production, which are all means by which you can balance the representative democracy that carries on in the council with the councillors and the leader, and we're having this big battle. Yeah, yes, right. A big battle on whether they should have the mayor system should continue, or should we go back to a leader and cabinet model in the council. And that's a debate we're having. But what's good about what's come in this review is this process whereby, particularly under co-production, and it's bastardized sometimes, but it really means that you don't get consultation, or the council comes up with something that consults people. All the stakeholders get together, ground zero, and decide what the issues are, how they must be resolved, and work together to do that. And it's involving the people, the community, and devolving budgets to areas of the community, even setting up a little parish council in the urban area, things like that. I think those processes are really important because it gets people to understand and believe that we can have a say, that there is a democratic process that works, and that even the people who are putting this forward say that what this costs will pay for itself, because it will be much more efficient running of the community, and the community will get more what they want. And the same goes for what was partially proposed by Corbyn before all that fell to pieces. But in the terms of running, like you said, Michael, that the public sector needs to be run by the public, by the stakeholders in those various sectors, and publicly owned, and not run bureaucratically as the private sector. All that debate is what we should be involved in. We should be trying to fashion. I certainly think that our China is operating about how things should or shouldn't be run. I don't think we should shy away from that discussion and that debate. It's an important one we have to have, in my opinion.
Okay, thanks, comrade. We lost a little bit just near the end of there. I think it was you were saying that if we want to make these changes, we've got to get the public on our side. I think that's what you were saying, roughly. Now, I've got a couple of comrades put their hands up. First is Mirok. I hope I pronounced your name right again. Mirok from Cyprus, yeah? Would you like to say something?
Actually, I think that Mike Rahman had raised his hand first.
I'll call Mike in after, no worries, yeah.
Okay.
No problem.
So, I'll not speak about the big frame, because it was a very clear and very realistic approach. I just want to add in it the question of the universities and the research in them. Comrade Roberts started saying that research was not enough, pharmaceutical companies who are not willing to proceed to research concerning viruses and pandemics. It is true that because the companies, it is not in the pharmaceutical companies, it is also in the university. Because from the time that research was funded, started getting funded by the private companies, actually what they were doing was to use the infrastructure of the universities and the research laboratories to pay just for some salaries, some projects, but they were at the same time controlling what was to be searched for. There was an experience with the previous coronaviruses, and there was an advancement. And then, because it was not so long-lasting, and because there was no profit, they stopped the research. Stopping the research means that the scientists who had the experience, who had just lost their the money, their contracts, the contracts were not renewed. So all this gathered experience is lost by changing the subject. So I consider that the way that research and universities have turned to commodification has costed a lot, not only for facing a pandemic, but also for advancing of science. Science is advanced according to how private money decide what is best, not even for the sake of knowledge and not also for the sake of people to get advantage from this knowledge. Yes, this is what I wanted to comment. We need to put this in the frame also, in my opinion.
Thanks, Murupi. Mike from Guyana.
My views doesn't differ from yours, but what you've been expressing. But specifically for Guyana, it's kind of a unique country in the sense that we've had two Stalinist parties, really Stalinists, who actually pursued nationalization in the 1980s, or 1970s, sorry. And they nationalized 80% of the economy, which included the sugar industry, the bauxite industry, the entire forestry, and lots of other timber, shipping and so on. But obviously it remains, and it's an important subject that the comrade who spoke before the female comrade, that we need to discuss, at least for us, for me, the question about what is going on in China. It's important because there are characterizations about what China is, state capitalist, socialist. We need to be able to be clear because our people here in Guyana are paying great attention to what is going on in China, on the war between China and United States of America. You may know that the Americans are attempting to land troops in Guyana to invade Venezuela. So we're in a very, very difficult situation at this moment, including the pandemic. So
Mike, is the public ownership that took place in the 70s, did they reverse all that? Is it all privatized back to the private sector now?
Most of it, you know, and the reason for that is because the same party that led it, Mr. Burnham, you know, the
Yeah, I
politician.
remember. Yeah.
He when he died in 1985, I was staying with Pat. We were campaigning against him, but it's a long story. When he died, his predecessor, Desmond Hoyt, he renationalized. He privatized most of these companies, and what remains is the utility companies, the electricity and water, are still state-owned companies, but they're run very, very badly.
Underinvested, bureaucratic.
Everything that goes with it, you know, I don't have to repeat it. It's a symptom of all these what the state capital. I don't know if you want to call it state capitalism. They reverted to state capitalism. I don't think that they.
It's capitalism, really.
Yeah. Right. So, Michael, you'll have to redefine some of these things because remember, we're dealing with a new generation.
Yeah.
We're not accustomed to these type of terminologies.
No.
And we have to reword it in a way which people really understand. My last point about it is before I finish is I would like comrades to consider the question about how do we, these are brilliant ideas. I mean, they're all implementable. The question is, how do we get our message across to the very ordinary people above the heads of these bureaucrats and capitalists? How do we get that message across in the most simplest language? I think that we're enjoying the best of humanity in the sense that the reality is that we are able to talk to each other, which has never been done before, or imagine that we could do this. Marx or Lenin and them had this facility, we would have made world revolution a long time. So we have great possibilities, and I was happy when Pat reconnected with me, and now living in Guyana. There's tremendous opportunities for what may appear to be a little group. I think we have great opportunities to change the world. That's my last day for now.
Thanks, Mike. What on the question of China, I don't want to cut off any discussion, but we're going to have a session in 2 months' time on, because we've already had a session on what kind of society China is and how it came about, but we're going to have a session on looking forward. You know, what needs to be done in China, what could be improved, and what changes need to be done. So I think all those issues will be taken up in there. The only thing is that I would like to ask, perhaps ask a question of Michael, because you didn't mention China in your lead-off, and I think that obviously China is an example where public investment is probably the biggest example of public investment virtually in history. Perhaps he could say something about the role of public investment and what it's shown in China in his response. You know. Okay, Michael, do you want to come back at this point? There's quite a lot of questions.
What Mike said about Guyana was interesting because it shows that taking into public ownership the major sectors of economy, particularly a relatively small developing economy, is not going to be enough unless there's a plan for production for need and investment. But really what you had there was a very brief period, actually, by the looks of it, no more than maybe 10 years before it was privatized back again. During that period, it clearly wasn't used, the public ownership wasn't used in the direction of providing social need, but to merely, I don't know enough about it, I'm sure Mike could go at length about this. It didn't go in the direction of what we've been talking about, of building a publicly owned public sector with a control over the economy, which will go in the direction of social need. It was a period where, very brief, that was then reversed. It's not the situation in China, because as you probably discussed, China actually had a revolution. It threw out the capitalists and the landlords, such as they were in China, and eventually the warlords who were backing them, and they all had to flee to Taiwan. So that China became a publicly owned economy in terms of the land and what industry there was, and it remained quite strongly a publicly owned economy and everything was done through the state for decades. It was only from the late 1970s, early 80s, that the economy began to be opened up to the private sector. But it's still the case in 2020 that China has the biggest proportion of state-owned assets as a percentage of the economy in the world. It has the highest stock of capital owned by the public sector in the world. Its level of investment by a state sector is way, way higher than any other economy in the world. And what has happened in the last 20, 30, 40 years is that China has been growing at double-digit growth for most of that time. It has expanded the economy to the point where 850 million Chinese have come out of what the World Bank calls a poverty level. They are beyond that level. That hasn't happened in India. It hasn't happened in Brazil. It hasn't happened in other big countries which still operate entirely with the dominance of the capitalist sector. So there are clearly very big differences in the way that China has developed, and that, in my view, is to do with public investment backed through public ownership and of state control and direction of the economy. Even where companies are not publicly owned and there's a sizable private sector in China, they have to follow the plan and direction of the state and the party that's behind it. Now, you can discuss the question, we're discussing the democratic public investment in this session, and there is little or no democracy in terms of control of that public investment in China. At local level, maybe local communes and councils have some say in what goes on in their area, but really it's dominated by a party machine that coming from the top and that controls the local councils and local governments, and even private sector companies have Communist Party officials on their board to keep an eye on them, to make sure they go in the right direction. There is no workers' democracy or participation. There are no elections to boards, to state firms, and of course, in local communities, no elections. Everything comes straight from the party appointments. So this is not democratic public ownership or democratic public investment. It is a bureaucratic control of that state. But it has, what you learn from that is a dialectical process, which I would sum up in this way. Unless you have dominant public ownership and state direction, you cannot meet social needs. It's no good having lots of people on boards, workers on boards, or having councils. They can do nothing if you don't have control of the economic levers of power in order to direct investment in the direction of social need and away from private profit. On the other hand, you cannot expect China to develop and develop the population as a whole and move that beyond the Chinese borders unless there was real democratic control and ownership of that amongst the people of China. It doesn't exist. So there's a different form of change that's got to take place in China, which is yet to happen. Maybe it won't happen. Maybe China will go backwards towards, as happened in Guyana, if you like, on a small scale, back towards a completely capitalist system. We shall see. But clearly, you need both. You can't have one without the other. You can't have democracy without public ownership and public investment. And you can't have successful public ownership and public investment without democracy. At the moment, China is proving that argument wrong, but only for 20, 30, 40 years in a very big economy. We shall see what happens over the next few decades.
Thanks, Michael. That's good. I think the discussion is progressing very well. Manzoor, would you like to say anything?
Yes, thank you, Pat. It's a very good discussion. It's what will be the method of the public ownership? Because if we say nationalization, it means bureaucratization. So what will be the method? Through shareholders to give to the workers? So what is the method?
You know, some of the most basic services in a lot of the poorer countries, even in Turkey, where my home is, we constantly get power cuts and even water cuts because of the poor organization and lack of public investment in these facilities. And the same applies, of course, to the internet in some parts of the world, or a lot of parts of the world. I mean, one of the things we're going to do in our manifesto is that the manifesto is not going to be orientated towards the rich countries, but it's going to equally cover, you know, the poorer countries as well, because I think that the problems of all these countries, you know, there's across the issues raised across all of them.
As Ghana, comrade says, in Pakistan during Bhutto times, we nationalized most of the part of the economy, in education, in transport, in sugar industry, in ghee industry, in cement industry, most of the major part of the industry. We nationalized. But the system which the run by the government, by the bureaucratic method, the bureaucracy which we have, the administratively during the democratic time under the control of bureaucracy, and during the military dictatorship, that all the departments run by the army people. So not in the control of workers. However, the workers got the benefits, they have pensionable jobs and like other benefits. But after the new liberal economies, the most of the departments the government have privatized, and we have now dominated by the private sector. And we have seen the difficulties. If we are saying the nationalization of these departments, then people are thinking their working is not good, because they were not run by the experts which they have in these departments, and their performance for public was not good during nationalization period. So the Manzoor question is that what kind of demand in our country, specific or underdeveloped countries, we have to put forward by the way which will got acceptance or economically viable in third world countries.
So I think from the comments in the discussion, it shows how important this issue has become, because ironically, if we want to make public ownership and public investment popular, we have to deal with this, tackle this question, because so many people have been convinced by the capitalist propaganda that public ownership, public investment is inefficient, even though the evidence is not for that. And also that they are bureaucratic and top-down and remote from the ordinary people's wishes and desires and interests. And I think that if we want to win that, we can't. In the past, we used to talk about public ownership in terms of and public investment in terms of state ownership, nationalization, and so on. And then we would add on under workers' control and management and things like that. But in a way, as a kind of secondary thing. I don't think we can do that anymore. I think that in some ways, the emphasis has to be the other way around, that we need to put the public in charge of the economy and the different branches of the economy. And the best way to do this is, as Michael Roberts explained, is through public ownership. And you can't do it through having privately owned things, because they will do what they want to do according to their shareholder interests and so on. So I think that this is important. But I mean, I agree with Themos, where he says that we don't need to come up with some, very detailed scheme, which we try to apply across the board. I think basic principles are all we need to emphasize, which is that the stakeholders, by this I mean the workers who are working in these industries, the customers who are buying and using these services, and there could be some other ones like the suppliers and some other, depending on each sector, of course, that the stakeholders should have a major say in the industry, not a token say, which is what you sometimes hear. If you're lucky, you'll get the odd, they'll say, well, we put one of these representatives on the board. Well, that isn't going to do it. So we need to say that these industries and services, public services, should be run by a partnership between the government or local government, whatever it might be, who own them on behalf of the people, and the actual people who are working in them, who know, all the productive processes, have got all that knowledge, the customers who are using the products and therefore can give feedback on them and improve their design and so on. So it's got to be a partnership between all the key stakeholders. And the good thing is that when they talked about stakeholder democracy, Blair talked about this, he was talking about in a privately owned circumstance. And of course, it doesn't work like that, because the private stakeholders, the ones who own the business in capitalism, they regard themselves as a totally different category from the other stakeholders, and they demand to have the overall say. Whereas in a publicly owned one, we can actually make it really democratic. So I think we don't need to go into great detail, but and inevitably there's going to be different sectors require different formats of public ownership, but we need to have clear principles. So for example, the Cooperative Party in Britain produced a very good document about how we could democratize public ownership, but there was so much variation between every sector that they looked at when they talked about it and they came forward with these relevant proposals, that the ordinary person would lose complete track of the principles involved. And I think we need to, that's what we can focus on, is how could public ownership be made and public investment be made democratic? What are the principles involved? And then leave the detail up to each country and each locality as they need it, you know? So that's all that I wanted to say about that. We've got a couple of participants who wanted to who've got to raise their hands. Before I call them in, that's Roy and Mike. Could I ask Michael maybe to come back, talk a bit more? Do you want to answer a bit more, or shall I? I'll tell you what, Mike. I'll take these last two and then sum up. Yeah, okay. So Roy, I think it was you who put up your hand first. Go for it.
Yeah, I hope this question isn't too off topic. But we've talked about democratic ownership and control and how that can happen. And of course, I mean, in Britain, we've got massively privatised from the 70s, where it wasn't just the utilities, but large sections of the private sector, car plants, nuclear energy, etc., were in the public sector. So we've got a long way to go getting back to that. We talk about how things might happen democratically, and we can put forward suggestions and try and work in developing some of those things now. In terms of the finance, Michael, you know, China's got a very big internal economy. We are very much a financial and tied globally. And people always ask this question about, you know, what will happen when they take their money away and it's already away, actually, isn't it, in these islands where they don't pay any tax. What would you say? What would you say in terms of a transitional position where we would be going in attempting to control the finance within an economy?
Well, let's. I'll go to Themos, who also put his hand up. He's going to be the last speaker, unless I can get Mike back. Okay, Themos, go for it.
Yes, I want to add a bit more detail on what I was saying. What I said is, as you said, that we don't need to go into big detail, but this doesn't prevent us from going into detail on specific issues. For example, when the Labour Party put forward a proposal to nationalize the railways, that could go into quite a lot of detail. How do we nationalize the railways, and how the control could be achieved there? What sort of structures do we propose to put in place, and how is the control being to be exercised? In Cyprus, if we put forward, for example, nationalize the banks. We have 4 or 5 banks. I don't know how many are, something like that. 2 are probably important. The others are just there. We could also put forward specific proposals. But as I said, this should not be generalized and in the general sense go beyond the basic principles as was discussed. So while on specific issues, on concrete situations, we have to be specific and explain what we mean. When we're talking in general, we should stay in general principles so that we cover what you said, that when they started to study each sector separately, they came up with a big mosaic of different approaches. And this is how it's going to work out anyway. I mean, it has to be worked out specifically and not try to impose generalized ideas and end up with a Soviet-style generalization that doesn't really work.
As Michael have said, we have experienced at least 10 years of the Burnham rule of public ownership, state ownership. The difficulty that we had, as this comrade has said, or the previous comrade, is that we have got to be more specific, because over the years, all what you've been saying about public ownership of the means of production, controlling the commanding heights of the economy. But we have not set out, at least I have not read anywhere, how we need to do that step by step. At the end of the day, it is the workers, working people who have got to implement these ideas. They have got to be convinced that this is workable, it is in their interests, and they will have to fight for it. Difficulty we have in Guyana, I'm sure each of these countries have got the same or similar problems. Whether the trade union body that is supposed to be giving leadership to this thing is bankrupt, totally bankrupt. And in fact, I'm part of that leadership here in this country. And I can't get him to discuss these matters. I cannot get him to do it. So we're supposed to have in this part of the world, South America, English-speaking country, Guyana, supposed to have the most progressive trade unions. But when you compare it to what they do on a day-to-day basis, they're still fighting, they're still operating in an atmosphere of fighting for better wages and better working conditions. And they're not at that political level because public participation is a political thing. It's a revolutionary concept. And a lot of these trade unions in the Caribbean and other parts of the world, underdeveloped world, are not there. So we have got to derive methods about how do we intervene in these situations. What somebody said, this discussion is an educational one. That is true because we have never had this type of discussion where most of us who are mature, I'm 70, and never been able to participate in the actual practical implementation of these ideas. So it's very important that we be more specific.
Okay, thanks, Mike. So, Michael, lots of stuff there. Lots of points. So
Yes,
you've got a fair amount of time to, because we're not due to, we don't have to finish until the hour is up. So
well, we don't want to tire everybody out.
No, well, we normally leave up to 2 hours for these discussions in case the issues.
Well,
the reason, Michael,
okay,
I'll leave you to it anyway. Go for it. Yeah.
The first thing I wanted to say was what Marina, I think you said from Cyprus about the universities. And I think that's a very important point because some of the most important technological innovations made in the last 50 years have not come from private investment or the private sector. They have come from the public sector and public investment, not just scientists discovering things, but in particular that I think of the internet, I think of personal computers, the microchip, a whole range of other technological innovations which are now very important to our lives, were products of the state sector, of the public sector, and of public financing of places like the universities, but also of small companies in order to develop these products. But all these innovations were not kept in public companies to develop so that we had a state company for the broadband, for everybody can get broadband free at the point of use, when instead they were hived off by, in case of drugs and vaccines, by pharmaceutical companies, in the case of technology by the likes of Apple, Microsoft, and so on, which became huge, great capitalist monoliths, which are a product of the work of the public sector and science and technology financed by the public sector. So that gives you, just a very important point to be made is that the public sector is not inefficient. In fact, it is probably the most productive sector in developing things that we need for social need. And it's been privatized and appropriated in its development as the process has gone, not only through ownership, but also through what it has produced over generations. And so that's one point I'll make. The second point is made, well, the public sector is bureaucratic and it doesn't pay attention to the people when companies have been nationalized and sectors have been completely nationalized, but they're all bureaucratic monoliths. I don't know how many of you have worked in the private sector in big companies, but I can assure you that big private companies are total monoliths as well. The workers in those companies have no say in what the executives and senior management do. The customers have little or no say apart from sending customer feedback. The decisions are completely from top-down hierarchical through these companies. There's no cooperative sense with workers being involved in any particular way or having any say. Private sector companies are entirely bureaucratic in that sense, no better or worse than the state companies. And it's just a particular lie which capitalists like to present, that in some way they provide a more efficient service because they work in the market. That's completely untrue. And as I showed very briefly in my introduction, there are plenty of research to show that actually the public sector is just as efficient, if not more efficient, when it does run strategic sectors of the economy than the private sector. And the other thing is no accountability to the private sector. As I pointed out, companies that get contracts from the government, outsourcing by the government to do work, if they go bust, if they steal the money, if they use the pensions deficit, there's no control, there's no accountability over this. There's no democratic control in the private sector. So the argument that the state sector is bureaucratic and therefore inefficient just does not hold water. It has no basis to it. The point I would make now also is that the COVID and the pandemic has given us an opportunity as socialists to explain how socialism, in the sense of democratic public ownership and investment, is the most effective way of meeting the needs of the population, not just in one country, but internationally. I mean, how more effective would it have been if we'd had a global public health system where the resources were cooperatively used in order to meet the pandemic with the right sort of international cooperation, which there was none during this pandemic, provide the resources that we could meet to get the vaccines and the medicines that might have helped, to have had a really public health systems in every country, which would enable us to robustly avoid these pandemics, apart from containing before. None of that existed. I would say that the public is very open to the idea that every country should have a public health system, that it's available at the point of use and free. So the same applies to education and other public services. If they have doubt about that, even in America, the majority of the population, when asked, is in favor now of a single care health system free at the point of use. Of course, it's being opposed by the vested interests of the private insurance companies, the private hospitals, and by the politicians. But there is a popular support for such a position, even the US, which has always been told that a national health service is a socialist Marxist plot. Well, it's now clear to the minds of the majority of even Americans that that will be the way forward. And that's what COVID has offered, offers the opportunity to develop the argument about public investment, public ownership, and democracy within that. Whenever there is a public opinion poll about whether companies should be publicly owned or not, whether it's in the case of the UK about renationalising the railways, in the energy sector, utility sector, and even in the banking and finance, there has been majorities in most countries for public ownership. People see that makes much more of a sensible way to deal with these big sectors of the economy which are out of the control of public and the social need. So there is an underlying support for all this. Now with the pandemic, there's an opportunity to present that. As one comrade said, of course, we have a blockage within the labour and trade union movement against anybody who's prepared to put that forward, because the bureaucracy within those organisations still resists the idea of moving in that direction because it's not in their interest. That would mean campaigning in a much more radical way than they're prepared to do, and they don't want to do that sort of radical campaigning action. And I finish on this point, everybody, that we can only have public ownership and public investment which is democratically run and meets social needs if there is radical action on the part of the working class. The two things go together. you can't just have a top-down takeover of sectors of the economy through the state with the working class in a passive position. The only reason that's taking place is obviously for a different vested interest, whether it's in Pakistan for the interests of the military or otherwise. You can only be achieved in a democratic way and a successful way if it involves workers' action and democratic control through workers' organizations. The two things go together. As Marxists, I like to think of it dialectically. You can't have one without the other. You won't have workers' democracy if the boards of the companies that the workers sit on are still privately owned and are producing for a profit. You can't have workers' democracy just by having public ownership of the basic and the strategic sectors of the economy. The two things go together. Radical action achieves one, and then you have to implement the other in order to sustain a successful democratic socialist approach to meeting people's needs.
Thanks very much, Michael. I think that's going to be a good thing for people to look at again. Both contributions from yourself, the discussion, your replies, I think very good. We had 17 comrades participating from 6 countries, so that was good. And Michael, we're making this as part of this is a process of different sessions, but we're doing it as part of a process of drawing up our manifesto. So we're actually going to use, and I hope you don't mind, but we'll probably take quite a few of your quotations and use them in the manifesto. So, you don't
want to ruin the manifesto in that way?
No. So we'll cherry pick. All right. No, but and I think that the manifesto is going to cover all of the things that have been raised. So I think it's going to be a pretty convincing document, very different from what's been done in the past. So it'll be interesting to see how it all turns out. We're going to produce. We're going to start producing soon, hopefully next month, some draft kind of chapters of the manifesto, and we're going to circulate them, and we'll also send them to you, Michael, to see if you're, so that we get feedback from people if they think there's things missing, or perhaps formulations that are not very good, or whatever. And then they can have a look at these. And these are not very long chapters. These, in most cases, might be like 5 pages or 6, 7 pages. So not too long to read, but because we don't want to produce a book out of this in terms of the manifesto. We want to produce a sort of like 50-page or 60-page document. And we're also going to produce a short 2-page summary of it for those people who don't have time to look at longer pieces. But we'll produce these chapters, these draft chapters, so with a couple of months for people to respond, and hopefully we'll get some feedback from the comrades. Thanks very much, comrades, and see you at the next meeting.